The European witch hunts? They weren't just about misogyny. Howdy, my dudes. Welcome back to Snarknotes. Today we're going to do what I actually started this channel for. Talking about books. In her book Caliban and the Witch, Sylvia Federici analyzes the social conditions that led to the witch hunts of the 14th through the 17th centuries. She talks about the misogyny spread by the medieval church, of course, but also the labor struggles that characterized the late feudal system and the Protestant Reformation, and the export of European class and economic structures to colonized countries and their peoples. Federici applies a Marxist analysis to the witch hunts, and that's critical to her argument. A disclaimer here. I'm not a historian, only a certified book nerd. This video is intended to be a kind of summary/review of this book, rather than any kind of definitive historical account. But in my humble opinion, Caliban is a great read, and if you have time to read it, you totally should. So to sum up Federici's argument, lower-class women of all races, and, I would add, the concept of femininity itself, had to be commodified by the state in service of capital gain and a market economy. The witch hunts effectively destroyed class solidarity by making working-class men distrustful and even resentful of women. As a result, the state, run by the nobility and the church and heavily influenced by the bourgeoisie, could radically restructure society to fit the upper class's economic needs. These groups consolidated their control over the lower classes without any lasting pushback because they were so successful in dividing the working class. Let's expand on that, shall we? 1. Serfs and proles, a brief history. Here's a fun fact. Feudal laborers had that sweet, sweet class solidarity. And with good reason. Federici writes, "The serfs were bonded to the landlords. Their persons and possessions were their master's property, and their lives were ruled in every respect by the law of the manor." That sucks. But there was a very important upside to serfdom, at least as opposed to being a laborer under capitalism. The serfs had access to land. They received a plot as compensation for the work they did for the lords, which they could use at their discretion. Serfs and other laborers also had access to the commons, which Federici says provided crucial resources for the peasant economy and fostered community cohesion and cooperation. That was vital. It strengthened solidarity among the serfs, allowing them to support each other and collectivize. In fact, the sociality and solidarity women gained from the commons enabled them to stand up to men, despite the fact that the church preached women's submission to men, and canonic law sanctified the husband's right to beat his wife. Women had a surprising amount of choice as far as living situations went, too. In 15th century cities, they could live alone, or as heads of their family, or with other women. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, they had a wide choice of occupation. They could be smiths, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, hat makers, ale brewers, wool carders, and retailers, and school teachers, doctors, and surgeons. Midwifery was big, too. And actually, women were the only ones performing the newly discovered cesarean cut. But all that began to change with the commutation of labor services into money payments, which did several things. First, it put laborers on a more contractual basis with their feudal lords. Second, it hurt poorer peasants by compelling them to pay their dues in money, rather than through the value their labor created. That forced them into chronic debt, which eventually caused many to lose their land. Third, commutation made it harder for peasants to differentiate between the work they did for themselves and that which they did for their landlords. Fourth, well-off peasants, who had enough land and money to buy their freedom, could now employ and exploit other lower-class peasants, further dividing the laboring class. What could go wrong, right? So obviously people fought back. They wanted to fundamentally change the structure of society, because feudalism was only working for a small portion of the population. The heretic movement was the people's answer. Federici explains that the movement denounced social hierarchies, private property, and the accumulation of wealth, giving people hope for the radical restructuring of daily life, work, property, sexual reproduction, and the position of women. Heretics denounced the medieval church as corrupt and exploitative of the laboring class. And between the tithes, the sale of indulgences, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the fact that the church was the biggest landowner in the Middle Ages, I'd say the heretics had a point. I think it's pretty crucial to note here that the heretical sects, at least the ones Federici discusses, had some pretty progressive views. The Cathars, a Gnostic Christian group, for example, hated war and capital punishment. They supported other religions, including Judaism, which is pretty awesome considering that anti-Semitism was on the rise in Europe at this time. They were vegetarians because they objected to killing animals. They respected women, who could be spiritual leaders and could live platonically with men, and they thought that gender was kind of meaningless anyway. And the Cathars rejected marriage and procreation because, historians think, they refused a life degraded to mere survival. Some within the Cathar sect practiced abstinence, but not all Cathars, and definitely not every heretic, did. In fact, some sects celebrated sex like a sacrament or as a means to achieve a state of innocence. There was another big event that gave laborers some leverage: the Black Death. Nobody wanted to waste what could be their final days working. They wanted to relax and, well, fuck. The peasants couldn't be bothered now by the upper class's directives of social and sexual norms and hierarchies. They couldn't be bothered to pay rent, either. Obviously, the lords didn't like that too much, and they tried to rein the peasants in, sometimes by reinstating slavery. But the peasants, as well as artisans and day laborers, weren't having it, and throughout Europe they banded together and started revolts. Peasants in Paris were able to set up a workers' democracy in 1413, and in Florence, cloth workers forced the bourgeoisie to give them a share of government and declare a moratorium on all debts incurred by wage earners, at least until the bourgeoisie teamed up with the nobility to crush the uprising. Other groups stormed castles and destroyed the archives where the written marks of their servitude were kept. In England in 1381, peasants made their intentions clear. The old law must be abolished. The ruling class had to go, and the bourgeoisie were scared. All that rebellion worked for a while. Food was cheap and accessible, wages were high, and pay was frequent. Like, employers had to feed their workers and pay for their travel to and from work. And peasants stopped having to work every day. They could choose if and when they wanted to work, and what tasks they'd be willing to do. These laborers were basically able to end serfdom, y'all. And they had a high standard of living to boot, because they were able to collectivize and determine the conditions of their labor. 2. The church and the state have now entered the chat. I'm sure you'll all be so surprised to know that neither the church nor the state was a fan of all these uprisings. The two institutions, if they're even separate entities, have a history of working together to degrade the working class, whether it was by requiring serfs to pay tithes, persecuting heretics, or demonizing sexuality. Here's the thing I didn't know until reading this book. The church didn't consider marriage a sacrament until the 12th century, with the Lateran councils. It also didn't consider homosexuality a sin until then either. But by making these declarations, the church politicized sexuality, making it so that the only good sex was that which resulted in babies, and that sex could now be considered a state matter. Before the plague, the church kind of let the use of contraceptives slide a little bit. Federici attributes this to the church's recognition that women may wish to limit their births because of economic reasons. But I mean, the church still didn't like it, especially if officials thought you were just acting to conceal a crime of fornication. And then the plague happened, and the church, and the state, and the lords started worrying that there wouldn't be enough babies. More on that in a minute. So this policing of sexual expression wasn't the only way the state got involved with people's sex lives. With all the peasant uprisings in the 14th and 15th centuries, the ruling class had to find a way to drive a wedge between members of the proletarian class, and that was by, content warning here, decriminalizing rape. Here's what Federici writes about it. In France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, provided the victims were women of the lower class. In 14th century Venice, the rape of an unmarried proletarian woman rarely called for more than a slap on the wrist, even the frequent case in which it involved a group assault. The same was true in most French cities. Here, the gang rape of proletarian women became a common practice which the perpetrators would carry out openly and loudly at night. The state-backed raping of poor women undermined the class solidarity that had been achieved in the anti-feudal struggle. And the ruling class didn't care, because this crisis, this legalization of rape, kept the masses preoccupied. As for the victims, we can all guess the outcomes. Their lives were completely destroyed, not only from the traumas they suffered, but from the fact that they had only one of two choices: leave town or become a prostitute. And, Federici writes, it also desensitized the population to the perpetration of violence against women, preparing the ground for the witch hunt which began in this same period. Interestingly, the ruling class institutionalized prostitution at the same time they decriminalized rape, but obviously it wasn't to protect sex workers. In the eyes of the ruling class, it was another method to distract, a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth, and, coincidentally, a remedy against homosexuality. Federici posits, in this process, the state became the ultimate manager of class relations and the supervisor of the reproduction of labor power. This action solidified the state's control over sex, and it was just one more step in the commodification of women's bodies to that end. 3. Policing sexuality and other things that suck. Before we go any further, I'd like to send a big hearty fuck you to any TERFs who might ever see this video. I'm not here for y'all to try to argue that what put a witch in danger was having ownership of a womb, and that we have to reclaim feminine power by tying women's identity to whether they're card-carrying uterus owners. No. The witch hunts were more than that. They were a power struggle in which the church and the state worked to enforce strict binary gender roles on people for capital gain. That means men had to be the wage earners, and women had to do the domestic work and childbearing. Federici writes, the female body was turned into an instrument for the reproduction of labor and the expansion of the workforce, treated as a natural breeding machine. That linked the notion of femaleness with the necessity to get pregnant, to breed. And if any person with the ability to get pregnant did so under conditions the church or state didn't approve of, their lives were in danger. If any person with the ability to get pregnant didn't want to do so, their lives were in danger. This period in history forced everyone into insanely gendered boxes and destroyed their ability to collectivize or seek solidarity in each other. Why, then, would we want to rehabilitate those same gender roles, those same expectations that a murderous state linked to people's genitals? So if you're in the business of reclaiming the archetype of the witch, you should be thinking outside of the gender binary, because binary thinking is one of the reasons we got into this mess in the first place. The witch hunts prove that the gender binary is a scarily effective way of dividing people and subjugating them under an oppressive system. Anyway, back to discussing violence as dictated by the binary. But first, peasants. As I said before, the church and the state, the nobility along with the bourgeoisie, weren't really down with all the peasant uprisings, and they were rightfully scared, so they teamed up to implement measures to divide the working class. Land privatization was one such measure, and it was accomplished in a variety of ways. The eviction of tenants, rent increases, and increased state taxation, war, religious reform, and the enclosures. All these things were devastating to the medieval proletariat, as it forced them off their land and further robbed them of their agency. Federici explains enclosures this way. It mostly referred to the abolition of the open field system. Enclosing also included the fencing off of the commons and the pulling down of the shacks of poor cottagers who had no land but could survive because they had access to customary rights. Large tracts of land were also enclosed to create deer parks, while entire villages were cast down to be laid to pasture. This denied the peasants any ability to grow food for themselves. Instead, they had to purchase it. They had to rely on markets where prices were determined by import-export systems, false scarcity, and the ruling and merchant class's desire for profit. As Federici says, it is not a coincidence, then, that as soon as land began to be privatized, the price of foodstuffs, which for 2 centuries had stagnated, began to rise. This shift, combined with a drastic devaluation of wages, devastated the peasants' diet. And on top of that, food shortages became common, thanks to famines and scanty grain reserves in cities. The rich were able to use food as a symbol of rank, while the poor had to resort to stealing and poaching, either from their neighbors or from the rich. It's very telling, then, that the diabolical banquet was a common theme in the witch trials, suggesting that feasting on roasted mutton, white bread, and wine was now considered a diabolic act in the caste of the common people. Also, interestingly, the famines of the 16th century coincided with a record number of witch trials. Wrecking peasant food systems wasn't the only effect of land privatization. Peasants lost all access to the commons, which, Federici states, encouraged collective decision-making and work cooperation, and where the material foundation upon which peasant solidarity and sociality could thrive. This obviously hurt all workers, alienating them, and making them even more susceptible to abuse by the ruling class. Communities were further divided by increased economic differences. Workers, particularly younger ones, were forced into vagabondage or itineracy to find work. This left the elderly, especially elderly women, alone and significantly less able to procure a wage. Proletarian women were affected the most by land privatization. Without the commons, they had a harder time forming connections and remaining autonomous, especially after social norms and the authorities began deriding the idea of women having other female friends. They didn't really have the option to migrate to look for work either, because nomadic life exposed them to male violence, especially at a time when misogyny was escalating. Remember, because rape wasn't really punishable by law, and in the 16th century, it became legal to rape a woman so long as you declared her a prostitute. Childcare also contributed to women's immobility, as did their inability to join armies. All of these factors coalesced to make women's economic independence impossible, and to make reproductive labor the most, if not the only, reliable form of labor for women. And the only time that was really compensated was when it was done for the upper class. As such, proto-capitalism reduced women to breeders. And, I'd like to posit, it irrevocably linked Western femininity to that purpose. And so did the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther. Oh, I'm coming for you, buddy. It dehumanized women into commodities for the reproduction of labor for the upper class and the state. Because for mercantilism to work, there had to be a big old never-ending labor force to exploit, profit from. And that obviously included colonized people as well. On top of all that, as if it wasn't enough, the ruling class, along with the church and the Protestants, were terrified of the population decline after the Second Plague and the smallpox epidemics of the 16th and 17th centuries. And they blamed the poor for low birth rates, shockingly. Federici asserts that these circumstances were what turned reproduction and population growth into state matters, and that the witch hunts were the most effective tool the state could use to extort women into growing the population and increasing the labor force. Federici also surmises that the bourgeoisie had a newfound fear of their subordinates, particularly low-class women who, as servants, beggars, or healers, had many opportunities to enter their employers' houses and cause them harm. Again, what better way than the witch hunt to literally kill that fear? 4. It's all downhill from here. Earlier we talked about the peasant revolts of the late medieval period. That same energy carried into the era of early mercantile capitalism, manifesting particularly in anti-enclosure movements. And since losing the common land was the most harmful for women, it was often women who led those movements, with pitchforks and scythes, digging up hedges that would fence in the land. Federici says that sometimes even men who protested the enclosures would dress like women to pull down the fences. Medieval soy boys, y'all. But the state and the bourgeoisie were so effective in their campaign to alienate the laboring class along gender lines. Authorities clamped down hard on proletarian social meetings, making it, you guessed it, even more difficult for workers to collectivize. The state and local governments also instituted this new thing called public assistance. There is still a debate about why, but Federici claims it was with the introduction of public assistance that the state began to claim ownership of the workforce, and a capitalist division of labor was instituted with the ruling class, enabling employers to relinquish any responsibility for the reproduction of workers, because the state would take care of any issues. And even then, there was an international debate on whether those dirty poors actually deserved any help. Federici reports that in England in the 16th century, public assistance was only rendered if the recipient agreed to go to a workhouse. We talked earlier, too, about how land privatization and the introduction of a capitalist system severely limited women's job opportunities, essentially forcing them into domestic work. In the 16th and 17th centuries, society deemed that marriage was now a woman's true career. Women who tried to work in crafts or other public trades were scorned. In fact, starting in the 15th century, craftsmen rallied to exclude female workers from their shops, presumably to protect themselves from capitalist merchants who were employing women at cheaper rates. Journeymen were in a similar boat. They petitioned authorities not to allow women to compete with them, banned them from their ranks, went on strike when the ban was not observed, and even refused to work with men who worked with women. This fear of women in the workplace grew over a century into a fear of evil temptresses, witches, who would steal men's penises and make them impotent, or make their wives impotent, or murder their children. Authorities stoked and utilized this fear to persecute and kill thousands of people, a large percentage of them women. And, Federici reports, there is only one recorded instance of men opposing the persecution. It was a fishing fleet from the Basque Country who heard about the torture and murder of their female family members and friends and ended their cod campaign 2 months early. Clubs in hand, they liberated a convoy of witches being taken to the burning place. Those men put an end to the witch trials in the Basque Country because they showed up. Many other men, however, didn't speak up or act to defend the witches because they feared implication, as the majority of men tried for this crime were relatives of suspected or convicted witches. Still other men actively accused poor women, and surprise, surprise, these dudes were often employers or landlords, individuals who were part of the local power structure and often had close ties to the central state. Remember, because they were afraid of their workers cursing them, or otherwise rebelling. It wasn't until later in the witch trials, when people had had time to steep in that culture of fear, that they began to accuse their own neighbors. Let's go back to another thing we talked about earlier, famines and the rising cost of food. Federici writes, in England, the witches were usually old women on public assistance, or women who survived by going from house to house begging. And if they showed any negative emotions at the prospect of not receiving food and, going hungry, they were blamed for any misfortune that may have affected those from whom they begged. They should have just worked harder and saved up money. But these older women, many of them widows or unable to rely on the youth who'd migrated out of their towns, didn't fit the mold as determined by early capitalist and heavily Christian society. That is, they relied not on their own hard labor. They didn't have husbands to be subservient to anymore, and they were old enough to remember living under not capitalism. All of these things were threats to a burgeoning capitalist hegemony. These women also weren't able to do any reproductive labor, and society shamed them for their aged bodies and for any sexuality they may have expressed. Because God forbid women have any sexuality that's not used solely for procreative purposes, right? That issue was heavily litigated by the witch trials. Women who advocated for the use of contraceptives, or who even dared to teach others about women's reproductive systems, as wise women did, were in danger. Women thought to have committed infanticide or to have otherwise hindered the conception-birthing process were in danger. And anyone whose sexuality was explorative or non-procreative was in danger. Taking pleasure in one's body was criminalized. The witch trials, along with liberalism and the Enlightenment, were instrumental in establishing that the body should be used for the production of goods or the reproduction of the labor force. And people who didn't willingly commit to those stipulations had to be broken for a capitalist system to truly take hold. 5. Strange magic. The witch hunts weren't limited to Europe. They were exported through colonization, and they were integral in breaking anti-colonial resistance, as well as enforcing indigenous peoples to comply with and do labor for a capitalist system. And I'm going to do a whole separate essay about that, because I can't do the topic justice here. Throughout Caliban and the Witch, it's pretty clear that the state and the ruling class had to take radical measures to alienate people from their communities in order to institute capitalism. These entities had to drive the medieval working class apart using gender roles as enforced by the Church and the Protestant Reformation. Federici sums it up pretty powerfully. It was in the torture chambers and on the stakes on which the witches perished that the bourgeois ideals of womanhood and domesticity were forged. And everyone, not just cis women, suffered as a result. Land privatization and the state's increasing encouragement of misogyny broke the solidarity of working people across Europe. It robbed them of their power of collectivizing and fighting back. I think the labor and mercantilist aspects of the witch hunts are vital to understand, because the same attitudes about work, the poor, sexuality, and gender roles persist to this day. But that's capitalism, baby! And it has to keep reproducing these attitudes and social and political mores, or else, what? We'd storm the castles of our lords and rip up our work contracts, stop paying rent, and use reclaimed land to feed ourselves and the people who are the most at risk in our communities. Maybe we'd even dance in the streets and have diabolical banquets, if we like. Y'all, thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. If you feel so inclined, please like and subscribe and leave a comment, and even share this video around with your friends. I would super appreciate it. I also have a Twitter now, so if you do that kind of thing, go follow me at Snarknotes_vids. Thanks again, and I hope to see you guys next time.